Another day, another Zavh LAVine trade rumor. This time, Jake L Fischer saying that the Chicago Bulls have held exploratory talks on DeJounte Murray in a Zavh LAVine deal. We're going to talk about that. Plus, why I think it's time to start realizing that more than likely Zavh LAVine staying in Chicago. We're going to get into all that and more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. I'm the host here, HAize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into the content for today. And this is yet another Zavh LAVine trade rumor. This time it comes from Jake L Fischer from Yahoo Sports, saying that the Bulls did have exploratory talks in trying to see if they can do a DeJounte Murray for Zavh LAVine trade. Now, this is the latest of a series of exploratory talks that we've heard, right? We heard that the Bulls reached out to see if they can get Darius Garland for Zavh LAVine, right? Then we heard just a couple of days ago that the Chicago Bulls have done their research and were gathering intel on Kevin Huerter in a potential trade for Zavh LAVine and trying to figure out why his slump was going on. And now we hear that the Bulls have inquired about DeJounte Murray, who is on the trade block from the Atlanta Hawks, to see if that they can try to get some type of talent back for Zavh LAVine. And it sounds like right now it's not even close to happening, that the talks never really gained much traction at all. And even Jake L Fischer goes on to say that, a lot of the teams that were reportedly in and interested in Zavh LAVine have kind of moved on to other avenues and other interests. And, this includes the Los Angeles Lakers, a team that kind of goes back and forth as being reported as one of the front runners to run Zavh LAVine. And then we hear like they're more so interested in DeJounte Murray. We heard that they even kind of preferred OG Anunoby at one point in time. That happened, right? And that moved on. Then the Sacramento Kings, right? That they kind of prefer Pascal Siakam and using those same assets that could go in a Zavh LAVine deal, but they'd rather give that up for Pascal Siakam than Zavh LAVine. And now it's this Atlanta Hawks rumor. And we heard this before as well. We actually talked about this probably about a month ago, in which, maybe that they may look to trade to pair Trae Young with Zavh LAVine. That never really made any sense. And I think what we're hearing, right, is that especially while you're hearing teams have kind of pivoted on, I think that this means that at this point, and I said it, right, I gave it before a 40% chance that Zavh LAVine stays in Chicago, as we hear more and more rumors, not to say that other teams can't become interested in Zavh LAVine, but it seems like if Zavh LAVine is moved, it means that he becomes the consolation prize by other teams if they don't get their number one targets. It doesn't seem like anybody has Zavh LAVine as the number one target on their board right now. Now, could this be something as far as a tactic to try to bring that trade value down, especially while Zavh LAVine, played his most complete game yesterday against the Houston Rockets? But I think when it comes down to it, it's just this, man. I just don't see it. I like when it comes, like I see that the way that this thing keeps going, and if Zavh LAVine keeps playing well, the Bulls aren't really pressed to trade Zavh LAVine. We know the trade request has been there, those type of things, and that's still valid, right? But when it comes down to it, it's like, if you're the Chicago Bulls and you're looking at if Zavh LAVine isn't going to make a big fuss, isn't going to be a distraction in the locker room, and it doesn't seem like he is right now, could that change? If he is here past the trade deadline, yeah, there's a possibility of that, right? Maybe he looks at it and says, man, I wasn't moved. I want to be moved. Going into next offseason, maybe it turns into a bigger fuss. But the fact of the matter is this. We can talk about all the teams that are rumored interested or not interested in Zavh LAVine until we're all blue in the face. But if it comes down to it, especially now hearing that Jerry Reinsdorf has kind of gotten involved and has stepped in and basically not liked any of the packages they're being offered for Zavh LAVine, it may mean that this front office and this team just has to hope that Zavh LAVine is going to keep not being a distraction, keep trying to play as well as he has been, especially defensively, hope that shot comes along, and then maybe you ride this out. Maybe you do see that Zavh LAVine and Kobe White end up figuring out a balance. Maybe you do go on a run through the play-in tournament where maybe you do actually make it into the playoffs. And then let's say anything does happen and you win 2 games, maybe even push a team in the first round of the playoffs, then Zavh LAVine's trade value, that value that people say is 0 to none, and then you maybe start looking at some things and saying, hey, now Zavh LAVine's trade value is high because we didn't pull the trigger early on the deal, and instead we let Zavh LAVine keep playing well. We went on a playoff run, and then maybe those teams that were questioning how Zavh LAVine contributes to winning, those questions become lesser and lesser in a case like that. So, it's interesting, right? There's a lot of different avenues and ways that it can still go. Zavh LAVine could still absolutely be traded, but I think as every day goes on and Zavh LAVine, other teams move on to other pieces, there are only so many players that are going to be moved at this trade deadline. Only so many assets that teams are willing to give up at this deadline, and a team could, fizzle out in the playoffs, not go the way that they thought they would, and maybe then that changes and turns some things for teams that in the offseason want to go towards Zavh LAVine. I know you have a lot of Bulls fans that say, oh, Zach's not going to be traded. You have some Bulls fans that say Zach requested a trade, he's going to be traded regardless. But honestly, the truth is probably somewhere between the middle of that. The Bulls may still take and try to make as many calls as they can, looking for a deal that fits into what they see. But ultimately, I think it also comes down to if that value just isn't there and he's playing well, right? I think that's the biggest thing in this. Before Zavh LAVine went down, he was playing and shooting his worst true shooting percentage since his second year in the league. And now you have a Zavh LAVine that is playing defense better. He's been locked in. He's moving the ball around. He's kind of fitting in with what this offense does. Of course, not scoring the 20-plus points per game that we've seen from Zavh LAVine before, but he's still playing well at times like this. You may see the Chicago Bulls just say, hey, Zavh LAVine's fitting in. He's not making a big fuss. Yes, the relationship between him and Billy Donovan maybe isn't what you want between your highest paid player and a coach, but it's amicable. They're being adults. They're going about it, and they're figuring it out. And Billy Donovan, to his credit as well, is really kind of making sure that the offense is still moving around with everybody. And so at the end of the day, man, it's a lot of different things what it comes down to for this Chicago Bulls team and the organization and what they could end up doing. And I think as we get closer to this, again, unless, a team makes a huge move before the trade deadline, and then you have a team like the Lakers like, hey, we can't just stay and pat at this point. We have to go out and make a move, and they're just willing to do that, maybe even part with the player that they weren't willing to part with before. But otherwise, I am starting to think more and more that this chance of Zavh LAVine, where I was at 40% of it before, right now I'm kind of at 45, 55%, like almost dead even between the chances that Zavh LAVine may still be a Bull after this trade deadline. And that may not be the worst case scenario if Zavh LAVine is playing well and fitting with this team. Now, this does raise other questions as far as DeMar DeRozan, right? And you hear some of those same Bulls fans that say things like, don't trade Zach, trade DeMar. He's the one that needs to go. And I don't think that it's an either-or situation per se. But if you don't have that market for Zavh LAVine, but the market is there for DeMar DeRozan, being that he's expiring, his contract's half of what Zavh LAVine's is, basically a little bit more than half, a little bit more than half, that you could look, and especially if he's not going to sign a contract extension, you may go ahead and make that move instead, but not necessarily meaning that you still aren't looking to move Zavh LAVine by the trade deadline. We'll end up seeing, man. There's a lot of different routes. You're going to hear a lot more rumors from it. And Jake L Fischer is somebody as well who isn't the most reputable as far as it. Like, a lot of the things is him, I think, kind of talking about where he think things could go, and then it's reported as something different. But at the end of the day, man, when you look at it, there are probably players that are going to be moved before Zavh LAVine gets moved. Pascal Siakam, it definitely seems like his market is larger. DeJounte Murray definitely seems like hhis market is larger. Then you still have the other players on the Atlanta Hawks as well that are kind of available that everybody's looking at. And then you also have like the rumor deal of like the Warriors now being open to move Wiggins and things like that. So there's a lot of other pieces around the NBA. And that's not to say that maybe something doesn't happen to where, like I said, that a team is looking at a consolation prize and Zavh LAVine ends up being that. But then you got to ask yourself, what is the deal that they're offering at that point for Zavh LAVine? But let me know what you guys think on all that down below. This whole Zavh LAVine trade saga, as it continues, develops, it takes a step forward, it takes a step back. I think at the end of the day, it's getting closer and closer to us just being able to say Zavh LAVine will be a Chicago Bull throughout this season and past the trade deadline. And it seems like more and more people are starting to realize that that is a realistic outcome in this scenario. But let me know what you guys think. Make sure you guys are following the show at Bull Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, bullcentralpod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Breaks Media.